Hello, everyone, and welcome to Café New Canadians. Café New Canadians is a virtual live chat that we do every week. And today we would be talking about combating bias, racism, and discrimination at the workplace. Now, Café New Canadians is brought to you by New Canadians. We're a TV and web show, and we broadcast our content on Omni Television. So if you're in Canada, you can watch us there. You can also watch our content on our YouTube channel as well as on our website. I'm your host, Shruti Dargan, and I will be hosting today's session, wherein we will be joined by three amazing guests who I'm very pleased to welcome with us, and they will be joining us. We've got Dipal Damani. She's a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant and speaker. We also have Shauna Cole. She's an HR strategist and an educator. And Antonio Urdaneta, who is a workplace lawyer, investigator, and compliance coach. Clearly, this panel today will have lots of exciting things to share and to be able to give you some tips on, what to do if you're in a situation wherein you're facing discrimination or racism at your workplace. So welcome to all of our guests. And before we get started with this session and get talking to them, let me just remind everyone joining us that if you're joining us on Zoom and you have questions for our panelists, please do use the Q&A tab within Zoom. We're also live streaming this session on YouTube, and you can ask your questions there too in the chat section. So a very warm welcome to our guests, and let's get this started. And of course, hear a little bit about you first. So I'd like to know from you a little more about yourself, your work, and what would you be sharing in this session so that the viewers have just a great idea of, about you. And of course, they can ask you the right questions. Let's begin with Dipal.
Thank you, Shruti, and thank you for inviting me to this session. So I'm an equity, diversity, and inclusion consultant, and I've been working in this area for the last 15 years, and consulting in this area for the last 5 years. What I hope to do in this session is really to provide some practical strategies and tips to the audience on how to address racism, bias, and prejudice in the workplace. So that's what I'm hoping to share with our guests today.
Well, thank you for that. Shauna, let's hear from you next and tell us what you wish to share today with the audience.
Sure thing. Hi, everyone. My name is Shauna Cole, and I'm a career strategist. I've built a business called Career Interrupted over the past couple of years, where I'm regularly sharing career content, practical tools, and advice to help job seekers. The reason I do this is I've got years of corporate HR experience, and behind the scenes, I saw stuff that was really, really unfair. So my mission is to help job seekers overcome that unfairness and to seek out equality in hiring processes and in their careers. So today, I hope to be sharing my practical behind the scenes knowledge, give some tips and tools for job seekers so that they can be successful in their search.
Well, thank you. Antonio, of course, you have that legal perspective to add today, but let's hear a little bit about yourself too.
Thank you, Shruti, for having me. Again, it's a pleasure to be with New Canadians and sharing some of my expertise with the audience. And I'm looking forward to learn more from my colleagues, panelists. I think that I will be the boring voice today, because I'm going to be talking about the basic stuff where everything else is built on top of. I will be talking about the bare minimums that you will see as laws in Ontario and other provinces in Canada. I practice employment and labor law, and it includes human rights in the workplace, which is basically what the area of equality, diversity, and inclusion, the topic that we're talking today. Before we continue, Shruti, I just want to make sure that our audience know that the information that we provide today is general information. It doesn't apply to specific cases, and if they have questions about their specific cases, they should consult with a licensed lawyer from Canada or another legal professional who holds a license in Canada. just don't act upon the information that you receive today, because you may create more problems than solving problems. It's just general guidance.
Thank you, Antonio. That's something that needed to be said, of course. And we today are not just joined by audience from within Canada. I also saw that we've got someone from Nigeria joining us. So welcome to all those who decided to join us today and learn from this session. Before we dive deep into today's topic, it possibly needs to be said that as delighted as I am to have this panel today, it's unfortunate that we need to discuss something like this happening in everyday lives for so many people. Racism, discrimination, bias, prejudice, microaggression, these are all terms that we may have faced or possibly know someone who has faced this, not just in the workplace, but in their lives and every day. So today, what we wish to do is be able to discuss the matter and, of course, look at it from the point of view of newcomers and immigrants moving into Canada. And some of them might not be aware of what they can do or what their rights are over here. So to be able to educate them on what they can do and, of course, share tips for anyone in that situation. So thank you to all the panelists joining us. Let's get started with the session. And I'd like to actually hear from you first. What are your views about Canada? When it comes to Canada, it's a multicultural country. We've got diverse communities all around. And we definitely are doing a lot when it comes to, having a space which is diverse, equitable, and to have that inclusive environment. Where do you think do we stand right now to be able to take this discussion forward? Dipal, I'd begin with you.
Sure. So, I think that's a really good question in terms of where do we stand right now. I would say that the fact that I'm actually working in equity, diversity, and inclusion means that we do have more work to do in this area. If we didn't, I don't think my job would exist. So I do think we have more work to do. And I would say that other countries look to Canada in terms of being a model for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I think that shows that, yes, we are doing some things right or well, but there's a lot of research to show that, in fact, we do have a long way to go. And I've seen that certainly in my practice as well, in terms of working with Canadian organizations, that we do have a long way to go in terms of being diverse, in terms of being equitable and being inclusive.
Yeah. Now, Shauna, I would actually ask you, because I know that you and I got talking before the session, and you said something which was that diversity isn't really there in equal measure throughout a country, and that's something that stayed with me. I'd like you to share that thought and tell our viewers what you had in mind then.
Yeah, sure. So I think, I don't know, when we look to Canada, we see it kind of as being the same everywhere. But the reality is, depending on where you're at in the country, diversity can look really, really different. So for example, I'm located in a smaller city in New Brunswick. It is very, very homogeneous here. And that might look really different from a Toronto or a Vancouver or wherever else you're looking in the country. So diversity and seeing different types of people around us is going to be different depending on where you're at in the country. And I think in terms of overall, like what employers are striving for, I think the panelists, I think you might agree with this. Like, it's like the past year or so that traction has really been increased, and literally that moment when George Floyd was killed, companies went, oh my gosh, this is like really a real thing, and maybe I need to do more than that annual subscription or something. So we're seeing more investment in it. We're seeing more investment in diversity and inclusion. At the end of the day, I think that companies look much like the country does, in that not all companies are going to be the same in terms of their commitment and capabilities around diversity and inclusion. Some are going to be really great at it and understand how to interact with other cultures because they've got that experience. Some companies are just getting started and really don't have a clue and have a lot of challenges when it comes to understanding working with people from different cultures, different preferences, and different social norms.
Yeah. Antonio, anything? Sorry, please go ahead.
Sorry, if I could add to that, actually, is that also it depends on the size of the company too. Like we're seeing that the larger companies have the resources to put towards diversity and inclusion. So when I say resources, they'll have the human resource capability, they'll have the funding dollars to put towards diversity and inclusion strategies. But when we get to our small and medium-sized companies, which makes up about maybe around 90% of our businesses in Canada, they may not have the resources to invest in diversity and inclusion. Now, that's not to say that they shouldn't be doing that kind of work. Definitely, they should be moving forward in that area in diversity and inclusion. But we're certainly seeing larger organizations have the resources to put towards it.
Antonio, I'd like to hear from you too. What is your take on this? Where does Canada stand, and what do you see in the workplace when it comes to diversity, inclusion, prejudice?
Yeah, I agree with Dipal and Shauna, both in it depends on the location and it depends on the size of the company, the sophistication they have with these the robust workplace law system that we have, to name it somehow, and I would start with that. I think that Canada has a robust legal system and a robust infrastructure to process when something wrong happens, when discrimination happens, when harassment because of race or color or place of origin happens. So we do have the system. I think that my concern is more on the education of those who make decisions. Sometimes they don't have all the information. They think they're acting well, but actually they're not. And I think that we should focus our attention to prevention and tackling education as a one step. I think that a lot of countries, I have the privilege of speaking English and Spanish, and I provide training about human rights in the workplace in Canada, but I also provide training in Mexico. And I get to compare legislations. They're pretty similar, but I believe that Canada has a very robust system that manages these laws. And when I say that, I talk about the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario, which is specialized in the Human Rights Code and anti-discrimination laws, but also the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal as well. And there is a commission at the federal level with Canada, and there is a commission also at the provincial level. So I think that, as Dipal said, we are ahead of the curve, but I think that we're not, we haven't crossed the line yet.
Now, something that Shauna said, which was, that companies have started to take notice, and in the last year or so, the efforts have, in a way, been amplified. But, every company, so to say, does something or the other. Now, what makes a company truly diverse and inclusive in their approach? Is just doing something, having one odd person from a different community enough? What should the representation be like? Because everyone does something, but where does it actually start to qualify that, yes, you're actually doing something when it comes to making a change or contributing towards change? Shauna, I'd like to know from your point of view, being in the HR space and interacting with companies, what would you say there?
Well, there's so many things. There's so many things. I just don't know. I think that what makes a company inclusive is that, particularly in the recruitment process, is that decisions are based on capability and skill and fit for the said position, not these obscurities around fit. So a topic that often will come up is this whole notion of Canadian work experience. Then everyone's like, what does that mean? And then the employer's like, I'm not really sure. Don't ask the question. It's all very uncomfortable. So I think particularly in the recruitment space, the most important piece of that puzzle is for an organization to be inclusive is that they're making decisions truly based on skill, capability, fit, and merit. And I think in order to be successful with that, a company's got to have some pretty good processes in place in terms of defining capabilities for a role and so on and so forth. And then I think also beyond that, a company is inclusive when it's valuing those diverse opinions and not saying like, hey, come to my company and become just like me and fit into the mold that we've already made. A company is acting inclusively when they're valuing diversity of those experiences that you bring. And all of this can be so largely subjective, right? And it's so subject to the leadership of the organization and the training that those managers who are leading the workforce have.
So you mentioned leadership and you mentioned training, and Dipal, I know that you've been working in that space in also training, companies when it comes to being truly diverse and inclusive. So tell us more about, what you do, and of course also your views on what makes a company truly inclusive and diverse.
Yeah, yes, I do training with organizations, and one thing that I always aim to do when I'm rolling out training with a company is to train the executive director, CEO, and the senior management team. And I say that because when you ask the question, what makes a company truly diverse, it really needs the buy-in of leadership. It really needs that CEO, the executive director, to be on board with diversity, equity, and inclusion. So without their buy-in, nothing else can fall into place in the organization. So I would say that is absolutely key, is to have them leading the diversity and inclusion efforts in the organization. And then the second thing is to have them accountable. Now, so often, we'll see organizations roll out training, or we'll see them roll out initiatives, but we don't see the accountability in that, right? So, in a year from now, how far has the organization progressed, or in 2 years and 5 years? Is there an actual measurement in place for the organization to assess, well, how far have we progressed on diversity, equity, and inclusion? And, what are our accountability measures on that? So I think that's really important. There's various areas of the HR is definitely a big area in terms of inclusive recruitment, hiring, and Shauna mentioned this, having an inclusive culture within the organization. That yes, you can hire for diversity, but what's really interesting is retention. You see, organizations will hire for diversity, but then the diverse folks don't feel like they belong in the organization, and then they quickly leave. And so retention really needs that attention, because and you really need to create that inclusive organization, that sense of belonging for diverse hires. And the other thing, actually, sorry, I would add to that is succession planning. So quite often we see diverse candidates come in and they get stuck in the front lines, and they're not moving up the pipeline. They're not moving up to the senior management ranks. And it could be for various reasons, but if with a more formalized succession planning strategy for diversity, that really helps to then move diversity up the pipeline, up the organization.
Well, both of you made some really good points there, and definitely things are being done, but there's so much more that needs to be done. And this puts a clear direction in front of us as to where we are, what needs to be done. And I hope that there are some employers listening to this session today as well, and that we're able to kind of motivate people or employees within, so that they can get talking to their HRs if something is wrong. Antonio, I'd like to hear from you now about, of course, we've been talking about diversity and inclusion and having that diverse team put together too. But when it comes to workplace rights and employees' legal rights, does it vary depending upon their status within the country, whether they're a temporary or a permanent resident here, or a citizen of Canada, or whether in their role, they're in a permanent or a contractual role? Off the bat, what would you say?
I would say that human rights legislation, human rights laws, it doesn't matter whether the person is a temporary resident, permanent resident, contract employee, or permanent employee. Human rights legislation will apply regardless. One thing that I have to mention, though, is that employers, and this goes a little bit to what Shauna mentioned about the Canadian experience, and maybe we want to talk a little bit more about that. Flipping the Canadian experience conversation for something that the employers actually need to do. And it's to make sure that the person that they retain, the person they hire, are authorized, legally authorized to work in Canada. The employers have that duty. So, and they need to meet that duty. They need to conduct due diligence and make sure that they have the SIN number and they're authorized to work in Canada. So a little bit different than Canadian experience, and we will go there when we get to that question. But human rights legislation will apply regardless. Other legislation that will apply regardless is insurance type of law, so compensation, the minimum standards as well. Even though a person was not authorized to work in Canada, yes, there are some issues there, but the Ministry of Labor will make sure that the person is paid for the work that that person completed. I mean, I'm not saying with this that people should go and work without being authorized to work in Canada. That's not what I'm saying. But these legislations will apply regardless.
Something that all of you mentioned actually has been Canadian experience. So let's discuss that right now, which is, if I rightly understood, you said that, of course, Canadian experience isn't something that companies should be asking about, but there are some essential questions about, a person being legally eligible or allowed to work in the country, and those details are necessary in the hiring process. But when it comes to Canadian experience, is that something that's legal for a company to ask for, Antonio?
My short answer is it depends, but I would like to lean towards don't ask that question. There are many ways that you can find out whether the person can do the job or not without asking that question. So it would be to put in two different ways that they can use Canadian experience for is I ask, do you have Canadian experience? And what's behind that question is, are you from Canada? Or do you have connections in Canada, right? The thing that they should be asking is, do you have Canadian experience? Not like that, but do you have the skills to do this job? So, for example, and I'm brainstorming here, there is a particular machine that is built in Ontario, and that machine has specific requirements, technical requirements for the person to manage that, to handle that machine. There is a similar machine in, let's say, Australia, right? But the requirements are different, and they need to go through, I don't know, 2 weeks training or a month training for them to actually be able to manage those machines. So the person who comes from Australia to Canada, and there's a different machine in Canada, I mean, similar but different technical things, they need to go through training. And that's a question that an employer should ask. Do you have the license or the registration to use this machine? And that's okay. But not asking, do you have Canadian experience, to try to find out whether it's the machine or is the person in Canada or not in Canada, right? So go directly to the question that you need to ask.
Yeah. And of course, it is important to first identify that whether the candidate is the right fit for that job or not. And of course, because of that, that question does become essential. Dipal, I had a feeling like you were about to add something, so go ahead.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, Antonio, on this, but I remember there was because I've worked in the immigration space as well, and have done research and consulting work in the immigration area. And I remember when that Canadian work experience came up repeatedly, and the Ontario Human Rights Commission finally tackled it and said, and came out and said, it is discriminatory to ask for Canadian work experience. So if an employer is asking you that, it is, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but it is discriminatory. Now, where it is, okay to ask for that is if it's a regulatory body. So if you're, if you want to become a doctor or a nurse or in one of the regulated professions in Canada, then yes, you do need to go through, Canadian experience to be licensed to practice in Canada. But any non-regulated professions, it contravenes the Ontario Human Rights Code to ask for Canadian work experience. So it is in fact for non-regulated professions discriminatory for employers to ask that.
Shauna, you have experience in the HR side of things as well. Now, sometimes, as Antonio and Dipal said, it becomes essential to even ask that question maybe in a different way, how you draft that question. But it is essential to find out what the skills a candidate has and whether or not they worked in Canada before. So how would you ask that is something that, that depends on employers. But what we're hoping to help our attendees today with is, if they're faced with a question like that, how can they tackle it best so that it doesn't come across that they don't have that experience, or if they do, but it may not be related to their field, how can they tackle that question?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things with that. One being, despite the fact that it's illegal, I think it's really important that everyone understand, like, even though it's illegal, unfortunately, it doesn't really mean that it's not going to happen. It could still happen. And you're probably not going to be like, that potential dream employer of mine asked me if I had Canadian work experience. I'm calling my lawyer, Antonio. You're not going to do that. Like, none of that is reasonable. It's like, you just kind of have to deal with it in the moment. So I think first, it's so important to cite that that could happen. And in fact, I've worked with many clients who have received interview feedback that's like, oh, we're really looking for someone that has more Canadian work experience. I teach in a master's of business program, and students consistently, they've done a 2-year degree in Canada, and they get the feedback, we're looking for someone with Canadian work experience. So it's still an issue, even though the law says we shouldn't be talking about it like that. So for me, if I was in a situation and I was asked by an employer, Shauna, do you have any Canadian work experience? I'd maybe seek to clarify that as my first step. Can you help me understand what soft skills you're looking for me to speak to? So, because what I'm hearing when someone asks that question is like, can you communicate effectively? Do you know how to interact with a team? Have you worked with a team before? Do you have problem-solving skills? Can you adapt to change? They're looking for signs that that you've got those soft skills. Not so much that you've got the Canadian work experience, but that's what it comes up as often. Often it's disguised under this unfair guise of Canadian work experience. So I think it's really, really important, if you are in a situation where you're asked that question, that you seek to clarify with the employer. I think that approach would be like hugely, hugely impressive. And it also gives you an advantage as the candidate. Like, what are you really looking for? So I can like tailor my response to meet your specific need.
Yeah. Now, discrimination, since we're discussing discrimination, racism, bias, prejudice, all of this, when it comes to being in the workplace, doesn't just happen once you're a part of a company. It begins right with the job search process. In when you're looking for jobs, do you find enough jobs that cater to your community or, your skill set? And specifically within the job posting itself, do not discourage you to apply. One would be that. Then how is it that, you're treated in the interview process or when it comes to the hiring selection process overall? And then what happens with you once you're part of a company or after you're laid off as well? So let's tackle each of these one by one so that we're able to help the attendees understand all the different phases and, whatever situation they might be in, they are prepared to be able to tackle that right. So when it comes to job search, my question to all of you would be, do you think bias when it comes to hiring is somewhat hardwired into the hiring system? Your thoughts there to begin with so that we can move on into the discussion there. Dipal?
So, I would say that it is, and the reason is because there is research to back that up. What's interesting, there was research done back in 2009 by a professor in UBC, Dr. Oriopoulos, and he took a resume of an immigrant, sorry, an ethnic sounding name, and then an identical exact same resume and put a white sounding name. So identical resumes, just the names were different. One was ethnic sounding, one was white sounding, and sent this to employers. So this is part of a research study. And what he found is that the ones with the white sounding name had a 40% higher callback rate. Now, this study was done in 2009. If we fast forward to 2017, there was another study done by Dr. Jeffrey Wrights at U of T and Dr. Rupa Banerjee at Ryerson University. So these are two universities in Toronto, Ontario. What they found is Asian sounding names, so on a resume with an Asian sounding name, had 20 to 40% less of a callback rate, a 20 to 40% lower callback rate. Now, what I find interesting is that this study was done 7 or 8 years after the Dr. Oreopoulos study. And it proves the same thing, that the white sounding name gets a higher callback rate. And so, what that tells me, what the research is telling me is that unfortunately, yes, bias is still baked in to our hiring process. And there, I think Shauna mentioned something earlier, is that, in the last year and a half, especially after the murder of George Floyd, organizations are now paying attention to all aspects of their organization, including their hiring practices. And so what I've been seeing in the last number of years, and especially in the last year, is organizations now employing or instituting software to do blind hiring, which means taking off the name on the resume and taking off any identifying information like address, so that they are able to find the best candidate for the position. So, in terms of skills and experience. So that is giving me hope that I am seeing now companies talking about implementing, AI software or bringing in software into their organization to do blind hiring.
I love that you mentioned those studies, Dipal, because I've been like, oh, there's the Harvard one too, right?
Yes,
And I actually, so in my career coaching practice, I work with a lot of newcomers, and I actually tested it. So, and Nigerian names in particular really stand out in a white job market, guys. Like the length of the name, it's very, very obvious to a hiring manager that this sounds like a person who is Black, right? Based on the name. So I had a candidate who highly qualified. We did the study. We literally did the study. Okay, let's just change your name. Adebayo, you are Adam. Let's see what happens. And immediately 0 to 6 interviews. And then in my experience as well, I remember, and it's like one of my regrets in my HR career, I remember sitting with this senior manager and like being the keen recruiter I am with my pile of resumes, and him going through the resumes, and every resume I present is a qualified candidate. And he looks at this one resume and he says, he sounds like an N-word. I don't want to interview him. He's not going to fit with my team, and screens him out. So I'm biracial. So my dad is Black. So it burned on like 500 different levels. And I never spoke out about that experience until the past year. So the appetite for the conversation, and I think we're creating an environment now for the conversation, and I'm so excited to empower newcomers with this information. So we're not all like, let's all just hide and pretend it's not there. No, we're equipping you to address these issues and be prepared for them head on. So I think it's a really powerful thing.
And I do hope that more research comes out, because it's, what I do in the training with organizations is cite research, and it's hard to discount research, and you kind of see the reaction on people's faces. The research. Oh, there's research that said this, right? So I really hope that there is more research gets done on bias in the hiring process, because that is actually a great mechanism to get employers to recognize, oh, actually, we do have bias baked in the hiring process, and we need to do something about this, hopefully.
And with what the two of you shared here, that needed to be said. But our intention today isn't to dishearten anyone watching this session, or to feel that, there's just no hope. Why should I even apply for so many jobs? What am I going to get out of it? Our intention is to be able to also provide actionable steps to be able to tackle this, right? So I read somewhere, and, Dipal, you mentioned about whitening the resume, if I can call it that, by having ethnic sounding names, or, to have a white name instead. I also read somewhere that there is a practice of someone even adding their hobbies, which are more Americanized hobbies, to say that, I indulge in hiking, or I do camping and stuff like that, which may not be common for immigrants who have moved from different countries, wherein this isn't really the culture or a favorite form of outdoor activity. So is that something that you've noticed too? And what would be your tips when it comes to something like this? Are you suggesting that one should change the name? Or are you suggesting that, one should go ahead with whatever? I personally, if I could add something here, is to maintain your identity and maintain it in a very strong and be proud about it. But what are your views as experts?
So I would agree with you, Shruti, that maintain your identity, because it is who you are. So don't whiten your name, don't, put in the, unless you do those hobbies, don't put in, the quote unquote North American hobbies. To be authentic to yourself, because you do want to be hired by a company that sees your value, and that and there's more conversation nowadays with companies about belonging and being able to bring out to be able to hire or to bring out the authentic person, to bring out the authentic employee. There's a lot of conversation around authenticity and creating an organizational culture that allows for that, for an employee to bring their entire self to the organization, not have to hide parts of themselves. So I agree, put your name on the resume, put your hobbies, if it's badminton, if it's, cricket or whatever, put that in there. Because if you do want to, eventually you want to be hired by a company that values those things in you, because eventually then, then when you're hired on, then you'll feel like, okay, I belong here. They value, these hobbies that I'm doing.
Yeah. Antonio, I'd like to actually ask you here, when it comes to, whether it is in the resume stage wherein one is applying for jobs, looking at job postings, or if it's in the interview stage of the hiring process, wherein, you've had conversations and you may have gotten a feeling that your accent somewhere played spoilsport in your hiring process. If someone feels, I don't know if cheated would be the right word here, or that they have been discriminated upon on the basis of, their culture, their community, their accent, what can one do? Mm-hmm. Legally, what should one do, or what are the measures that you would recommend?
So technically speaking, I will say what the technical piece is. However, practically speaking, maybe it's not the right way to go. But I want to start with Shauna. I'm sorry that you had to experience that with that client of yours. That shouldn't have happened, and hopefully that doesn't happen again. The technical, if I feel that I was discriminated against, the first step is to address it with the company that you think discriminated against you. And that's easy to say, but it's a little bit more difficult when you are the person who is experiencing that discrimination. And the way that they do that is by actually writing an email or writing a letter. I believe that this is what happened, right? Please confirm, or let's talk about it. That's the technical piece. If they don't answer, then or they answer in a way that it's general and they don't address the point, or you still are not satisfied with that answer, the system in Ontario, which is different from the system at the federal level, but at the federal level, there are options as well. I'm just going to use Ontario as an example. Every province will have a different system, but pretty similar in its principle. The Ontario system allows anyone to file an application with the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario. And the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario will assess whether that application may have merits, and then will invite, and I say invite, but they will actually tell the company to respond to the allegations. And then it's a trial like a trial that you go through with the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario at some point. But that's the technical piece. I don't think that for one interview it makes sense that you spend all this time and all this energy doing or trying to get justice, which, I mean, I'm upset at myself because I'm saying this, but I would prefer that they spend their time actually finding a job and actually building their ties with the community. However, I will insist with whether associations or support groups that may have a little bit more influence to actually make sure that that company understands what happened, and if it was an issue about discrimination, that they actually fix it. I wouldn't leave it as that, right?
Yeah. Now, you mentioned something that, it isn't worth one's time to actually be spending all of that time to be going after a company that may just not, it's they're losing out on you as a candidate. That's how I see it, right? And I'd like to, of course, discuss the red flags to watch out for when it comes to in your job search. But before that, a quick question from the audience. And Shauna, I'd ask you this because you mentioned about the experience that you had with a recruiter as well. Olavale is asking us, how easy is it for a Black newcomer to be accepted in a racially diverse workplace in Canada? What's your opinion there?
I think there's so many variables. I think there's so many variables, but I'll give you this. I think that you, as any color newcomer coming to this country, have huge opportunity to overcome the biases that we're talking about. It doesn't all have to be doom and gloom. First step is building this awareness. You've got the awareness. Now we can take actions to beat it. So I think as far as being accepted, some of the really specific things that you can do, one is to work and build your professional network. So if you are a professional, please get on LinkedIn, build a profile, meet some people, make some friends. They're going to help you not only to get a job, get accepted in the workforce, but this is a huge life transition, right? So imagine having that support system. Look for that support system in newcomer associations as well. I know in the smallish city that I'm in, there are tons of resources available to bring people together who have similar backgrounds. I think that you need to know as well to be accepted into the workforce here. I think you need to know and get really, really confident in what it is you have to offer, and say to yourself this: I am valuable. No matter what nonsense I face in this exhausting system, no matter what nonsense I face from employers, if I face racism, whatever the case, I am valuable. Can you please repeat that to yourself? So know what value you bring. So I think absolutely, as a Black newcomer, you can find your spot here, but I think it's on you. You're empowered now. You've got the information. So it's on you to take those extra steps to make the transition experience for you as positive as possible.
Very well said. Thank you, Shauna, for that. And I'm sure, that is something that encourages so many people in our audience today as well. Now let's discuss the red flags that one should be watching out for within a company, or, when you're applying for a job. To just make sure that we're able to cover a lot more today, I'd like to ask you, what's the one or top two red flags that you would want to highlight? Shauna, I'll start with you and then move on to Antonio and then Dipal.
Sure. I think for me, watch for those questions. Even if you run a quick Google search on like illegal interview questions Canada, bam, you're going to get a bunch of them, right? There's just get familiar with those questions. That's a really, really great way to gauge an employer's awareness of their obligations and focus on human rights and diversity. I know I've worked for companies where, as an HR practitioner, a ton of time and money was invested in me and my knowledge to ensure that I knew, and then I knew to equip my managers, like, don't go there. It's not even relevant. So watch for those types of questions. Creep their social media. If you go on their social media and everybody looks exactly the same, something is up. I would say that's a huge red flag.
Yeah. Antonio, I'll come to you next. What would be your top or top two?
So with my legal hat on, there are three things that I drill employers to actually have: employment agreements in writing, a health and safety policy, and a respecting the workplace policy. If you ask those questions and they say, I don't have employment agreements in writing, I don't have a health and safety policy, and I don't have a respecting the workplace, which is basically harassment and violence prevention in the workplace, I don't think that that's a good place where you will find a safe environment to work. You will find quite the opposite. Or if they say something like, well, I don't have it, but thank you for raising the point, I will make sure that that I look into it and make a decision about these documents that you're asking for, then it's a good sign. But if they don't have it and they don't want to do anything about it, I don't know, I would be skeptical to go there.
Yeah. Dipal, coming to you, something that you'd like to add here now.
I was actually going to say, Shauna hit the nail on the head with look out for the interview questions. And I think in those interview questions, it really tells you whether that organization is at least working to be inclusive. You know, one of the things that I do with clients or organizations is look at the interview questions they're asking, you know, and it really is telling if an organization is inclusive and they really do value diversity. And I would also say, you know, use that interview to ask them about their equity, diversity, and inclusion policies. You know, ask them, oh, you know, I'm curious to know if you have a equity, diversity, and inclusion policy for your organization, and if you have, you know, and how that's rolling out in the organization. I you know, as someone from another country, I value inclusion, and just wanted to know more about your organization's inclusion policies and the work that your organization is doing. I think that will really be helpful to then help you make a decision as to, okay, is this company a good fit for me? And the other thing is, sorry, I just lost the train of thought there. But if I remember it, I'll come back to it.
Yeah. No, while we have you here, there's a question actually I wanted to ask you too, which is, you know, we're talking about racism, discrimination, but it might not always be overt as well. So whether it's within the job search or whether, you know, once you have a job, you're interacting with your colleagues and your seniors, what if it's microaggression? And those often come in the form of comments here and there, right? And especially as someone who is an immigrant to Canada, comes from a different culture, microaggression is still something that may not be overt racism, but you know it's something is wrong and you know that something is happening. What would your advice be to be able to tackle that? Dipal, I'll actually ask,
okay,
what's
sure.
your thought there? And then I'd like to actually ask Antonio as well.
Sure. Yeah. So you're right. Microaggressions are you know, they're everyday slights, put downs, comments. And, you know, and I remember the first couple of times I experienced microaggression, I was like, that didn't sound right. You know, and I have this weird gut feeling. So I would say trust your gut. If you feel like you've been, you know, put down or you've had some comment come your way that doesn't feel right, you probably are right. It's probably a microaggression. So trust your gut on that one. So, you know, if you've experienced that, you know, what I would say is be kind to yourself. I think most of all, be kind to yourself, you know. Do what you need to do to feel safe, to feel okay, and then to, you know, if it's a, you know, a colleague, that has said something to you, you might want to have, pull the colleague aside and say, I'm just curious to know where that comment came from, and have that discussion. Let them know how that comment made you feel. If that comment came from a manager, then same thing. Sort of take some time for yourself, breathe, and then I would address it with the manager, but in a calm way, and just say, just kind of curious to know where that comment came from, and that when you said that, this is how I felt about it. So hopefully, by creating that awareness with the colleague or manager, it creates change. The manager and colleague will kind of, the hope is they'll realize, oh, I was hurt by saying that. I hurt my employee or I hurt my colleague, and I'm going to change that. If that behavior doesn't stop, then, I think Shauna and Antonio is probably more qualified to provide that advice, but there is, a human resources department that you can go to. And what's interesting is sometimes I get called in by a human resource department because of an issue like that, to come in and provide training on microaggression and what it is and what you can do about it. So I would say, don't let that go if it's not being addressed in your workplace. Certainly talk to HR, and then there are, and then reach out to other, there's employee resource groups now in organizations. So you may want to reach out to employee resource group, let them know, I've been kind of going through this, and get some advice from them. And then you may want to get some advice from some outside folks as well. And I think Shauna and Antonio are probably better equipped to suggest who those are.
Shauna did mention actually that, it's important to be able to have that conversation with people that within Canada too. And those should be the people who can guide you about the workplace, who can guide you about job search. And to add to that, what you just said here, Antonio, I'd like to ask you, besides all of this, now these would be the preliminary steps, right? But if it goes out of hand, when should one actually resort to taking legal action? Or what are some of the first steps to begin with when it comes to something like that?
Not so much legal action. As Dipal said, the first time, tackle it, talk to the person directly, try to understand what happened, and see if that person is actually apologetic and doesn't want to do it again, didn't know, now knows better, right? Or the contrary, the person will continue doing that. And if the person continues doing that, then we may be talking about harassment against the Health and Safety Act of each province and federal level, or harassment against the Human Rights Code of Ontario. So discrimination because of race, color, ancestry, and so on. So now the company has a duty to investigate. They have to investigate and make sure that they label it, whether it was harassment or not. And if it was harassment, they need to take steps to address the issue and fix it, usually training or so on, like Dipal mentioned, and Shauna may agree with me as well. One thing about microaggression, before Shauna, I would love to hear your side of what happens after the second time and the third time in the workplace. But before we go there, I want to mention that I love employers who don't stay with the bare minimum, with the basics of what it's illegal, like harassment, discrimination. I love those employers who raise the bar and talk about civility in the workplace, right? And talk about microaggressions in the workplace. Microaggressions themselves, separate microaggressions individually. They're not illegal per se. They may become illegal because of harassment or discrimination, yes, together. And they escalate up. So I love those employers who raise the bar and talk about civility in the workplace.
So very well said. Now, I'd actually like to ask you, Antonio, that oftentimes, it might just happen that because we've got in Canada, especially people from all over the world, and they might not be aware of what their rights are, or what's all right to actually. Everyone on the panel here said, speak up, reach out. but there could be some doubts about, is it right? Would it affect my status in the country? If I do so, would there be any repercussions for me? What do I know? Do I know enough about the country, or how the workplace functions? Any thoughts that you have there about what to do in this situation?
Well, do the right thing, and don't leave with that, because if you say, well, I'm just gonna push through. It's just gonna be a few months that I'm gonna be working here. Maybe I'll get promoted. I'll try to get promoted, and so on. Then 3 years pass by. You're experiencing those 3 years, and now you have a breakdown. Now you have you're coping with mood disorders. Now you have to actually try to file an application at the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario. So even though it's very difficult to have that conversation at the beginning, don't let it go, as Deepal mentioned. Don't let it go, because it will grow on you. And discrimination, the cases that I have, I wish I could do something like reach to the heart of my clients and just fix it, because you live with that forever. So don't let it grow.
Shauna, coming to you, I'd actually want to ask you, we've in today's session so far, we've talked about, the importance of speaking out and reaching out and addressing the problem, and not just taking legal action. I mean, that should be the last resort, definitely, but, different ways that one can actually gather support. But to begin with, it all comes back to the employer and their mindset and, their approach when it comes to diverse and inclusive hiring. As someone who has worked with employers and is somewhat bridging the gap between talent and, employers, you're the middle person there who's helping that happen. What are your suggestions? Because I'd like to conclude with the suggestions that all of you have, not just for employees, but employers as well. So what is your suggestion for employers, those who are watching us or would watch the session later, on how they can develop a more inclusive mindset?
Yeah, I think that the journey to being more inclusive is something that is deeply personal and needs to happen at the leadership level, like we talked about. And I think that instead of, as an organization, instead of thinking of diversity as like, oh, let me get my checklist of performance indicators for the year, and you just like, oh, diversity program met. Instead of going there, what if we started to think about diversity and inclusion as a leadership capability? I think as leaders, we recognize there's stuff we're good at, there's stuff we're not good at. We're okay with that skill set being a little bit mushy and always having to be tweaked. I think what employers can do is move beyond this checklist approach and key performance indicator approach to recognizing diversity and inclusion as being a core leadership skill, and becoming okay with the fact that, yes, it is a deeply personal journey to understand my biases and to overcome them. If we can shift the language around that, I think it'll position us, companies, in a much better place to deal with different types of people with more heart, and to reap the benefits of that diversity in their workforce as well.
Antonio, what would you say here? Any advice that you have, or a warning that, be mindful, or there could be legal actions too? So
I agree with Sean about the checking the boxes. It's not enough checking the boxes. And I don't know, you didn't mention workplace culture. I'm mentioning, the lawyers mentioning the business side of workplace culture. But okay, I think that they need to leave their statements. They need to leave their documents, their goals. If they have an EDI, an Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion program for the next 2-3 years, everybody in the company needs to live that experience, that understanding, learning. So I think that the workplace culture should be connected with all the legal things that we have, and also raising the bar, as I mentioned before.
People, your 2 bits about, what should employers be doing, or
I'll speak for me, I guess, to the employer. So 2 things, and I think, and Shauna and Antonio mentioned this. certainly at the leadership level, if there's anything I can't stress more, it's the leadership has to, and it's not just buy-in, but sort of what Shauna was talking about is really inhibit inclusion and really take on that inclusive mindset, and really live and breathe that, because once the CEO or executive director is able to do that, the rest of the organization follows. And secondly is to bake equity, diversity, and inclusion into your strategic plan or into your business plan. That is absolutely key. I've worked with organizations where it's not baked into their strategic plan, and the leader at the time is really keen on diversity and inclusion and instituting measures or strategies, and then that leader leaves, and then the next leader comes in and may not have that intention to pursue it as much. And so it kind of gets left to the wayside. But whereas if it's baked into your strategic plan, your business plan, and continues, is in a continuous document, a strategic document, you ensure that it's going to be sustainable over the long term in your organization. And so whoever that new leader comes in has to then adhere to that strategic plan, business plan, and implement on it. So I would say two things is to have the inclusive mindset as a leader and to bake equity, diversity, inclusion into your strategic plan and business plan.
Thank you so much, Dipal, Antonio, and Shauna, for sharing your experiences, telling us about others' experiences, what they may have faced, and of course, sharing these tips for people to be able to tackle the situation. And my last question here to all of you would be a short one, which is in one word or two, what would be a motivational message for attendees or for employees in a situation like that, in any phase, job search, workplace? What would your message be, given that this is all happening during a pandemic where things anyway seem uncertain? So what would your message be? Shauna, I'll begin with you.
That's a hard one. I think, oh my gosh.
I'm glad you went first, Shauna.
No, I think it's you matter. I think the message is you matter, so you deserve to do something about the situation.
Thank you. Antonio?
I would say that there are good days, bad days. There are good companies, bad companies, good employers, bad employers, and you may experience some or all of it. Just make sure that you have your goal very clear in your mind and you keep going towards that goal, because that would happen if you keep moving forward.
And people, coming to you now, what is your concluding message here? I
would say hope. I'm certainly, hopeful that if you really want it, it will happen. You can strive to get it. And I see hope with employers as well. Certainly in the last year and a half, I've been seeing a lot more movement on inclusion, and especially around immigrant inclusion in the workplace as well. And so I see the hope there. And so that really motivates me. It really does.
Thank you once again to all of you. I see lots of thank you messages pouring in the chat section here too. So clearly you've helped not just our attendees, but people who would be watching the session much later. Thank you once again for your time and for sharing your advice and your insights today. With this, we've come to the end of today's session. We talked about combating bias, racism, and discrimination at the workplace. We organize such sessions every week, so do stay updated by signing up for our newsletter and by staying in touch with us through our different social media channels. And that way you wouldn't just know about the next session, but also all about the different content that we have for you. On our YouTube channel, we of course have these videos and lots more. So do subscribe and stay updated by clicking that notification bell so you don't miss anything. Thank you once again to not just our panelists, but everyone who attended this session. For those who joined us through Zoom, you would see a survey pop up on your screens while you're logging out. And that's a short one for you to share your feedback and help us do better the next time. Thank you and have a safe time.